Adolf Hitler allowed only one man to address him intimately. That man was Ernst Röhm, the commander of the Stormtroopers, and an openly gay man. But was their bond just friendship? Or was Röhm actually Hitler's secret lover who had to be silenced? This is the bloody truth behind the execution of Ernst Röhm. The story of Ernst Röhm and Adolf Hitler did not begin in the corridors of power, but in the filth of the trenches. Röhm was born for war. A Bavarian captain with a thick neck and a bulldog's constitution, he found his spiritual home in the catastrophe of 1914. While other men broke under the strain of artillery fire, Röhm thrived. He was a creature of the front, a man who despised the softness of civilian life and worshipped the raw masculine energy of combat. The war took half of his nose and left deep, jagged craters in his cheeks, scars he would later wear with more pride than any medal. He was a soldier's soldier, profane, aggressive, and utterly fearless. When the war ended in 1918, Röhm, like millions of others, felt the world collapse. The surrender wasn't just a defeat, it was a violation. The German army, the most potent fighting force in history, had not been defeated on the battlefield, or so the legend went. They had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home, by Jews, communists, and weak-willed politicians who signed the shameful Treaty of Versailles. Röhm returned to a Munich that was unrecognizable. The monarchy was gone. The streets were ruled by chaos. Communist revolutionaries had declared a Soviet republic in Bavaria, and the old order was being swept away by a tide of red flags. For a man like Röhm, this was hell. He remained in the truncated army, the Reichswehr, serving as a political officer in Munich. His job was to act as a liaison between the army and the dozens of right-wing paramilitary groups springing up in the beer halls like poisonous mushrooms. He was a spider in a web of illegal weapons. He controlled secret caches of machine guns, mortars, and rifles that had been hidden from the Allied inspection commissions. He was the machine gun king of Bavaria, a man who could equip a private army with a phone call. What he lacked was a voice, a drummer who could march the angry masses to his beat. Then he met the corporal. Adolf Hitler in 1919 was a drifter. He was awkward, devoid of social grace, and burning with a frantic, undirected energy. He was a nobody in the rigid class structure of the German officer corps. But when Röhm saw him speak in a smoky beer hall, he saw something else. He saw a weapon. Hitler had a voice that could electrify a room. He could take the incoherent rage of the unemployed veterans and channel it into a laser beam of hatred. Röhm, the pragmatist, saw the potential immediately. He didn't see a leader, at least not yet. He saw a useful instrument for the army's interests. Röhm took Hitler under his wing. He introduced the awkward Austrian to the right people. He provided the trucks, the funding, and most importantly, the muscle. When hecklers tried to shout Hitler down, it was Röhm's men, rough ex-soldiers with brass knuckles and rubber truncheons, who beat them into silence. This was the birth of the Sturmabteilung, the SA. They were the Hall Protection Squad, the guardians of the movement. The bond that formed between them was intense and peculiar. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, they became du, the intimate form of you, reserved for family and the closest of friends. This was momentous. Even as Hitler's power grew, even as he became the messiah of the movement, Röhm remained the only man who treated him as an equal. They were front fighters, united by the shared trauma of the trenches, a brotherhood that supposedly transcended all other loyalties. But there was a shadow in this friendship, an open secret that would eventually become the knife in Röhm's back. Ernst Röhm was homosexual. In the 1920s, this was a crime under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. But Röhm did not hide it. He was not a man who skulked in the dark. He was defiant. He frequented the gay bars of Berlin and Munich, surrounding himself with young, virile men. Röhm's homosexuality was not just a sexual preference. It was a political philosophy. He believed in the supremacy of the Männerbund, a warrior society of men. He argued that the heterosexual man was compromised by women, softened by the demands of domesticity and family. Only the man who loved other men could be the perfect soldier, the ultimate revolutionary, because his loyalty was purely to his brothers in arms. He viewed his nature not as a vice, but as a superior form of masculinity, akin to the sacred band of Thebes or the Spartans. This created a bizarre paradox at the heart of the rising Nazi Party. The movement publicly preached a rabid homophobia, labeling homosexuality as a Jewish degeneration and a threat to the Aryan birthright. Yet, the man commanding their street army, the Iron Fist of the party, was visibly unapologetically gay. His inner circle in the SA was filled with handsome young adjutants, stories of wild parties, and sexual favoritism circulated constantly. The enemies of the Nazis, the Social Democrats, and the Communists mocked them relentlessly. They published Röhm's private letters. They called the Nazi Party a hotbed of vice. And yet, Hitler did nothing. Throughout the 1920s, he protected Röhm. His private life is his own affair, Hitler would snap when complaints reached his ears. I need him for the struggle, not for a morality play. It was a decision born of cold necessity. Hitler needed the SA to conquer the streets. He needed the violence. And Röhm was the only man who could control the 3 million thugs, brawlers, and murderers who wore the brown shirt. Hitler was willing to overlook the vice as long as the bayonets were pointed in the right direction. Röhm, in his arrogance, mistook this utility for acceptance. He thought his value to the movement made him untouchable. He thought the do was a shield that could never be broken. The relationship faced its first great test in 1923, during the Beer Hall Putsch. It was a chaotic, doomed attempt to seize power in Munich and march on Berlin, modeled after Mussolini's March on Rome. Röhm led his men to occupy the war ministry, standing firm while bullets flew. Hitler, by contrast, fled the scene when the police opened fire, dislocating his shoulder and hiding in an attic. When the coup collapsed, Röhm surrendered with the dignity of an officer. Hitler was arrested in his pajamas, trembling. While Hitler sat in Landsberg prison, dictating Mein Kampf and reshaping his strategy from revolution to politics, Röhm was adrift. He tried to keep the band SA together, but he grew frustrated with the politicals, the suit-wearing Nazis who wanted to win votes rather than crack skulls. He resigned and left for Bolivia in 1925, serving as a military advisor. For 5 years, the two friends were separated, but Hitler could not do without him. By 1930, the Nazi Party was surging in the polls, but the SA was in chaos. It was a headless monster, brawling indiscriminately, threatening to alienate the middle-class voters Hitler needed. He sent a telegram to Bolivia, "I need you." Röhm returned. He assumed command of the SA in January 1931. He found an organization of 70,000 men, and within 3 years, expanded it to nearly 3 million. He turned a gang of ruffians into a shadow army that dwarfed the official German military. He gave them a sense of purpose. He told them they were the vanguard of the revolution, the true inheritors of the new Germany. But as the brown shirts marched through the Brandenburg Gate in January 1933, holding their torches high to celebrate Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. The clock began to tick. The victory they had fought for was the beginning of their end. Röhm looked at the torchlight and saw the dawn of a second revolution, a radical overturning of society where the fat cats, the generals, and the aristocrats would be swept away, replaced by the soldier workers of the SA. Hitler looked at the same torches and saw something very different. He saw the need for order. He saw the need to placate the army and the industrialists to prepare for the next war. He saw that the street fighters who had carried him to power were now a liability. The tragedy was set. The stage was built. The actors took their places. The scarred warrior believed he was the partner of the Messiah. The Messiah was beginning to realize that to become God, he would have to sacrifice his brother. The year 1933 was a time of intoxication for Germany, a fever dream of flags, drums, and retribution. For the men of the SA, it was open season. They were the masters of the street. They set up makeshift prisons in cellars and warehouses, dragging in communists, union leaders, and Jews, beating them into bloody pulps. They acted as auxiliary police, immune to the law. Röhm was at the height of his power. He was given a seat in the cabinet. He was feared by everyone, except perhaps by the quiet, bespectacled man who raised chickens and believed in the occult, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was the head of the SS, the Schutzstaffel. At this point, the SS was still technically a subordinate branch of the SA, a small elite bodyguard unit. Himmler hated this subordination. He despised the chaotic, rowdy, working-class nature of Röhm's brown shirts. He envisioned the SS as a knightly order of racial purity, cold and disciplined, not a drunken mob. And beside him stood Reinhard Heydrich, a tall, blonde, violin-playing psychopath who headed the SD, the party's intelligence service. Together, these two men looked at the bloated, noisy SA and saw an obstacle. They saw Röhm not as a comrade, but as a dinosaur that needed to be extinct. But the real danger to Röhm came from the Reichswehr, the traditional German army. The aristocratic generals looked at Röhm with undiluted loathing. They saw him as a mutinous captain leading a rabble of homosexuals and street thugs. Röhm made no secret of his ambition. He wanted the SA to absorb the army. He wanted to be the supreme commander of a people's army. In private meetings, he called the old generals old fogies and reactionary swine. He bragged that he could crush the army with sheer numbers. This was Röhm's fatal miscalculation. He didn't understand that Hitler needed the army. The SA could beat up shopkeepers and break up communist meetings, but they could not invade Poland. They could not conquer France. They could not build the 1,000-year Reich. Only the professional, disciplined machinery of the German military could fulfill Hitler's geopolitical dreams. Hitler knew that if he had to choose between the 3 million rowdy brown shirts and the 100,000 disciplined soldiers of the Reichswehr, he would have to choose the soldiers. But Röhm wouldn't listen. He grew louder, more reckless. He began to criticize Hitler in private. Adolf is a civilian, he would grumble to his inner circle over wine. He's betraying the revolution. He's getting into bed with the generals. These words were dangerous. In a totalitarian state, the walls have ears, and Heydrich's SD was listening to everything. Throughout the spring of 1934, the tension in Berlin became suffocating. It was a three-way poker game between the SA, the army, and the Nazi hierarchy, with Hitler holding the cards close to his chest. Röhm felt the temperature dropping, but he attributed it to the jealousy of the politicals. He didn't see the trap closing. He believed his personal loyalty to Hitler was a magic amulet. To placate the rising tensions, Hitler suggested that Röhm take a leave of absence. Take the month of June off, he suggested. Send the SA on leave. Let things cool down. Röhm agreed. He planned a medical retreat at Bad Wiessee to treat his rheumatism. He invited his top commanders to join him for a conference and a holiday. He invited Hitler to come as well to smooth things over. It was the perfect setup. The plotters, Himmler, Göring, and Heydrich, saw their chance. With the SA leadership gathered in one isolated hotel, unarmed and off guard, they could be decapitated in a single stroke. But they needed to convince Hitler. They needed to turn the do into hatred. They began to manufacture evidence. They forged dossiers claiming that Röhm was planning a violent coup, a Röhm putsch. They claimed he was conspiring with the French ambassador. They claimed that the SA was preparing to assassinate Hitler and seize power in Berlin. They fed these lies to Hitler, drop by drop like poison in his ear. Hitler wavered. He was naturally indecisive, prone to procrastination. Killing Röhm meant killing a part of himself, a part of his own history. It meant admitting that the party was fractured, but the pressure was immense. The president of Germany, the ancient field marshal Paul von Hindenburg, was dying. If Hindenburg died while the SA was running wild, the army might seize control and declare martial law, ending the Nazi regime. Hitler had to act. He had to prove to the army that he was the master of his own house. The tipping point came in late June. Himmler and Göring fed Hitler a final desperate lie, that the SA in Munich had already taken to the streets, that the rebellion had begun. It wasn't true, but it was enough. Hitler's indecision snapped. The sentimental friend vanished, replaced by the cold-blooded executioner. He would not just order the arrest, he would lead it. He would fly to Munich and crush the traitors personally. On June 29th, Röhm was at the Pension Hanselbauer, playing cards, drinking, and joking with his men. He sent a message to Berlin confirming that the SA was on total leave, that not a single man was armed or on duty. He went to bed that night thinking of the conference the next day, of how he would talk sense into Adolf, of how they would laugh about the old days. He had no idea that in Berlin the engines of the Junkers transport planes were warming up. He had no idea that the long knives were being sharpened. The devil's brother slept his final peaceful sleep, unaware that the dawn would bring not the sun, but the eclipse of his entire world, the Junkers. Ju-52 transport plane tore through the night sky, its 3 engines screaming against the storm. Inside the cabin, the air was cold and smelled of stale sweat and high-octane fuel. Adolf Hitler sat near the cockpit, staring out into the black void. He did not speak. His face, usually so animated, was a mask of deathly pallor. Beside him sat Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, scribbling furiously in a notebook, already drafting the lies that would explain the coming slaughter to the world. Behind them, a squad of SS troopers sat in grim silence, their submachine guns resting across their knees. They were the executioners of the new order, handpicked for their loyalty, ready to kill on a nod from their Führer. It was 2 a.m. on June 30th, 1934. The flight from Bonn to Munich was rough. Turbulence shook the plane violently, but Hitler seemed not to notice. He was in a trance of rage. For days he had oscillated between indecision and fury, but now the die was cast. The due, the intimate friendship that had defined his political life, was over. He had convinced himself that Ernst Röhm, the man who had stood by him in the beer halls, the man who had built the SA from nothing, was a traitor. He had to be. If he wasn't, then Hitler was simply a murderer killing his best friend for political convenience. And Hitler could never be just a murderer. He had to be the savior of Germany. The plane touched down at Munich's Oberwiesenfeld airfield just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The tires shrieked on the wet tarmac. As the engines wound down, Hitler stood up. The trance was broken. He was now pure energy, a coiled spring released. He marched down the steps of the plane, his leather coat flapping in the wind. 2 armored Mercedes limousines were waiting on the tarmac, engines idling. The first act of the tragedy played out right there in Munich. The local SA leaders, men who had been summoned to meet their chief of staff later that day, were dragged out of their beds and brought before Hitler at the Ministry of the Interior. August Schneidhuber, the police president of Munich and a high-ranking SA general, was one of them. He was a veteran Nazi, a man with a chest full of medals. He looked at Hitler with sleep-crusted eyes, bewildered. He started to salute. "Traitor!" Hitler screamed, his voice cracking. He didn't wait for an explanation. He walked up to Schneidhuber and ripped the epaulets from his shoulders. "You are under arrest. You will be shot." Schneidhuber was stunned. He stammered, "Mein Führer, what have I done?" But Hitler was already moving past him, leaving him to the SS guards, who dragged him away to a waiting truck. The message was clear. Rank, history, loyalty, none of it mattered. The purge had begun. The convoy of cars sped out of Munich, heading south toward the Bavarian Alps. The destination was Bad Wiessee, a quiet, upscale spa town on the shores of the Tegernsee. It was a place of healing, of mineral waters and fresh mountain air. Today, it would be a place of judgment. Inside the lead car, Hitler sat in the front passenger seat. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road. The driver, Erich Kempke, drove with white-knuckled intensity, pushing the heavy Mercedes to its limit on the winding country roads. Behind them, a truckload of SS troopers from the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment, struggled to keep up. These men were the elite. They were the asphalt soldiers, the new Praetorian Guard that Himmler had built to replace the rowdy SA. They despised the brown shirts. They had been waiting for this moment for years. The Pension Hanselbauer appeared through the morning mist around 6:30 a.m. It was a charming, rustic building with wooden balconies and flower boxes overflowing with geraniums. It looked peaceful. The only sound was the chirping of birds and the gentle lap of the lake water against the shore. Inside, the SA leadership was still asleep. They had stayed up late the night before, drinking, laughing, toasting to the second revolution that Röhm had promised them. The car screeched to a halt on the gravel driveway. The silence of the morning was shattered by the slamming of car doors and the heavy boots of the SS hitting the ground. Hitler jumped out before the car had even fully stopped. He didn't wait for his guards. He didn't wait for a plan. He was possessed. He marched up the steps of the hotel, his face twisted into a snarl. "Open up," he roared, pounding on the heavy oak door. A sleepy porter stumbled to the door, fumbling with the keys. As soon as the lock clicked, the door was kicked open. The SS swarmed into the lobby, submachine guns raised. The staff cowered behind the reception desk. Hitler ignored them. He knew exactly where he was going. He knew the room number. He had been a guest here before. He bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, followed by a handful of SS men and police detectives. He reached room 321. The door was unlocked. Inside, Ernst Röhm lay in a heavy, alcohol-fueled slumber. The room was warm and smelled of stale cigar smoke. His uniform was draped over a chair, the insignia of the chief of staff glinting in the dim light. On the bedside table lay a half-empty bottle of wine and a sleeping pill bottle. Hitler burst into the room. He stood over the bed, looking down at the scarred face of the man who had been his due for 15 years. For a second, he just stared. Then he exploded. "Röhm!" he screamed. "Get up! You are under arrest!" Röhm groaned and opened his eyes. He blinked, trying to focus. He saw the figure standing over him in a trench coat. He saw the pistol in the hand of the SS man behind him. "Adolf," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "What is this? What's happening?" "You are a traitor," Hitler shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You have plotted against me. You are under arrest for high treason." Röhm sat up, the sheet falling away from his chest. He was a barrel-chested man, covered in hair and old scars. He looked vulnerable, stripped of his uniform and his power. "Heil, mein Führer," he said instinctively, but there was confusion in his eyes. "I haven't plotted anything. This is madness. Who told you this?" "Shut your mouth," Hitler yelled. "Get dressed. You are coming with us." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving the SS to guard the bewildered chief of staff. Röhm sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He couldn't process it. Arrested? By Adolf? It had to be a mistake. It had to be Göring's doing, or Himmler's. Adolf would never do this. Not to him, not to his Ernst. But in the hallway, the tragedy was turning into a farce. While Röhm was dressing, the SS were kicking down other doors. In room after room, they found the SA generals in various states of disarray. Then they reached the room of Edmund Heines. Heines was a brute of a man, a convicted murderer who had been Röhm's deputy in Silesia. He was also notoriously, openly gay. When the SS kicked open his door, they found him in bed with an 18-year-old SA trooper, his personal driver. Hitler, who had been pacing the hallway like a caged tiger, heard the commotion. He marched to the doorway of Heines's room. He looked inside. He saw the two men in the bed. This was the moment he needed. This was the moral justification he had been looking for. The political threat of the SA was abstract. A coup plot was hard to prove. But this was visceral. This was degeneracy. This was something he could sell to the German public, his face contorted in a grimace of theatrical disgust. "This is the filth we have to clean up," he shouted to his entourage, making sure everyone heard. "Take them out. Shoot them." Heines, realizing the gravity of the situation, began to fight. He was a big man, a brawler. He lunged at the SS men, shouting curses, but a rifle butt to the face silenced him. He and the young driver were dragged out of the room, stripped and bleeding, and hauled down the stairs. They were thrown into the back of a truck destined for a firing squad in Munich. Back in room 321, Röhm was now dressed. He wore a blue suit, not his uniform. He looked smaller, without the brown shirt and the Sam Brown belt. He walked out into the hallway, his head held high, trying to maintain some dignity. He passed Hitler. Their eyes met. Hitler did not look at him with friendship. He looked at him with the cold, dead eyes of a shark. He didn't speak. He just gestured for the guards to take him away. As Röhm was led down the stairs, he saw his staff being heralded into the lobby. They were all there. General von Krauser, Count du Moulin-Eckhart, the SA press chief. They looked like ghosts. The arrogance that had defined them just yesterday was gone, replaced by a terrified realization. The party was over. Outside, the mist was lifting. The sun was trying to break through the clouds. A bus had been commandeered to transport the prisoners. Röhm was shoved into the back seat. He sat next to a young SS trooper who held a submachine gun pointed at his ribs. As the bus pulled away from the hotel, Röhm looked back. He saw Hitler standing on the steps, surrounded by his black uniformed guards. He was watching them leave. Röhm raised a hand, perhaps to wave, perhaps to protest, but the bus turned a corner and Hitler was gone. The drive back to Munich was a funeral procession. No one spoke. The prisoners stared out the windows at the Bavarian countryside, the rolling green hills, the cows grazing in the fields, the farmers tipping their hats as the convoy passed. It was a surreal contrast. Outside, the timeless rhythm of rural life continued. Inside the bus, the architects of the Nazi Revolution were being driven to their deaths. Röhm's mind was racing. He was a soldier. He knew how to calculate odds. He knew this was bad, but he still couldn't believe it was fatal. Arrest? Yes. Prison? Maybe. But execution? Impossible. He was Ernst Röhm. He was the only man Hitler trusted. This was a power play, a warning. Hitler wanted to clip his wings to force him to submit to the army. Fine. He would negotiate. He would offer to resign. He would go back to Bolivia. He would do whatever Adolf wanted. But surely, he wouldn't kill him. They arrived at Stadelheim prison in Munich around noon. It was a grim, fortress-like building with high brick walls and barred windows. Röhm knew it well. He had spent time here in the early days of the struggle. It was a place for political prisoners, for enemies of the state. Now he was the enemy. The bus drove into the courtyard. The heavy iron gates clanged shut behind them. The sound was final. It echoed in the pit of Röhm's stomach. The prisoners were ordered out. They were processed with efficient bureaucracy. Names taken, pockets emptied, belts and shoelaces removed. Röhm surrendered his personal effects, a wallet, a watch, a cigar case. He was led to a cell in the new wing of the prison, cell 474. The door slammed shut. The key turned in the lock. Röhm was alone. He paced the small cell. 4 steps forward, turn, 4 steps back, turn. He could hear shouting in the courtyard below. He climbed up to the small barred window and tried to look out. He saw SS squads assembling. He saw trucks arriving. Then he heard the shots. Crack, crack, crack. A volley of rifle fire. Then silence. Then a coup de grace, a single pistol shot. Röhm froze. He knew that sound. He had heard it 1,000 times in the war. That was an execution. They were killing them. He gripped the iron bars until his knuckles turned white. Who? Who were they shooting? Schneidhuber? Heines? Down in the courtyard, Sepp Dietrich, the commander of the Leibstandarte and one of Hitler's most loyal butchers, was presiding over the slaughter. Hitler had given him a list. "Shoot 6 of them," he had said before flying back to Berlin. But the list grew. The SS men lined up the SA leaders against the brick wall of the prison yard. They didn't bother with blindfolds. "Heil Hitler," some of the SA men shouted as the rifles were raised. They died with the name of their executioner on their lips, unable to comprehend the betrayal even as the bullets tore into them. Röhm listened to the volleys all afternoon. Each crack was a hammer blow to his denial. They were killing his boys. They were killing the leadership of the SA. And if they were killing the lieutenants, what would they do to the general? But the execution squad did not come for cell 474, not yet. While Röhm paced his cell in Munich, the purge was spreading like a cancer across Germany. In Berlin, Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler were orchestrating a bloodbath that went far beyond the SA. They had unleashed the special commandos of the SS and the Gestapo. Black sedans raced through the streets of the capital. They were settling old scores. They weren't just targeting the brown shirts. They were targeting anyone who'd ever crossed them, anyone who knew too much, anyone who stood in the way of absolute power. General Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor and a bitter rival of Hitler, was at home having lunch with his wife. The doorbell rang. When he opened it, gunmen burst in. They shot him dead in his hallway. When his wife screamed, they shot her too. Gregor Strasser, once the second most important man in the Nazi Party and a rival to Hitler's authority, was arrested and taken to the Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse. He was thrown into a cell and shot through the bars like a caged animal. Herbert von Bose, a conservative politician and advisor to Vice-Chancellor Papen, was gunned down at his desk. Papen himself, the man who had foolishly thought he could tame Hitler, was placed under house arrest, his teeth pulled, his power broken. The Night of the Long Knives was not a surgical strike. It was a massacre. It was the moment the Nazi regime shed its skin of legality and revealed the beast underneath. There were no trials, no warrants, no judges, just lists of names and men with guns. And at the center of the list, the name that had started it all was Ernst Röhm. Back in Stadelheim, night had fallen. The shooting in the courtyard had stopped. The prison was quiet, save for the footsteps of the guards in the corridor. Röhm sat on his cot, staring at the wall. He had not eaten. He had asked for a uniform so he could die like a soldier, but the request was ignored. He was still in his crumpled blue suit. He thought of Hitler. He thought of the years of struggle, the beer halls, the street fights, the dreams of a new Germany where the frontline soldier would rule. He thought of the letters Hitler had written him, the public defenses, the do. Why? The question burned in his mind. Why, Adolf? I made you. I protected you. I loved you. He didn't know that back in Berlin, Hitler was pacing in the chancellery, his eyes wild, his voice hoarse. He was drinking tea, eating sandwiches, and receiving reports of the deaths. Schleicher is dead, Goering would report. Good, Hitler would nod. Strasser is dead. Good. But when the name Röhm came up, Hitler hesitated. The bloodlust faltered. Not yet, he said. Leave him for now. Hitler was still wrestling with the ghost of their friendship. He could kill a rival like Schleicher without blinking. He could kill a subordinate like Heines with disgust. But Röhm? Röhm was different. Röhm was the only person left in the world who knew who Adolf Hitler really was. Not the Führer, not the Messiah, but the awkward, angry corporal from the trenches. Killing Röhm meant killing the last witness to his humanity. But the logic of the purge was ruthless. You cannot kill the pack and leave the alpha wolf alive. Himmler and Goering knew this. They whispered in Hitler's ear throughout the night. He is the head of the snake, mein Führer. If he lives, he will seek revenge. The army demands it. The people demand it. Hitler listened. He looked out the window at the dark streets of Berlin. He saw the future. A future of absolute power. A future of war. A future where no one could call him do ever again. He turned to his deputies. His face was stone. Do it, he said, but give him a chance. Let him do it himself. In Shell 474, Ernst Röhm shivered in the darkness. He did not sleep. He waited for the dawn of July 1st. He waited for the footsteps. He waited for the end of the Brotherhood. Sunday, July 1st, 1934, dawned hot and oppressive over Munich. The sky was a hard, pale blue, promising a day of stifling heat that would bake the stone walls of Stadelheim prison. Inside cell 474, the air was already thick and stagnant. Ernst Röhm had not slept. He had spent the night pacing the small stone floor, his mind a feverish loop of confusion, denial, and rising panic. He was still wearing the blue suit he had been arrested in, now crumpled and stained with sweat. His collar was unbuttoned, his tie loose. The man who, 48 hours ago, had commanded an army of 3 million was now reduced to a caged animal, waiting for his master to decide if he would live or die. The silence of the prison on a Sunday was heavy. On ordinary Sundays, the sounds of church bells would drift over the high walls from the city, calling the faithful to Mass. Röhm could hear them now, a distant, mocking reminder of a world of order and piety that seemed to have vanished. Yesterday, the courtyard below had echoed with the crack of rifles as Sepp Dietrich's SS execution squad murdered his top lieutenants. Today, the courtyard was quiet. The blood had been washed away with hoses, swilled down the drains into the Munich sewers. The bodies of men like Schneidhuber, Heines, and Count du Moulin Eckhart had been trucked away in the night to be cremated, their ashes scattered so they could never become martyrs. Röhm sat on the edge of his cot, his head in his hands. He was trying to construct a defense. He was a soldier. He understood courts-martial. He would demand a trial before the Supreme Court in Leipzig. He would call Hindenburg as a witness. He would call the generals. He would prove that there was no Röhm putsch, no conspiracy with the French, no plan to assassinate Hitler. It was all a fabrication by Göring and Himmler, those jealous vipers who had poisoned Adolf's mind. Once he stood face to face with Hitler, really face to face, without the SS guards, without the hysteria, he could fix this. The bond of the trenches was deeper than politics. Adolf was emotional, yes, prone to fits of rage, but he was not a fratricide. He would not kill his due. But deep down, beneath the layers of rationalization, a cold dread was spreading. Röhm knew the history of political purges. He knew what happened when a leader decided to consolidate power. He remembered the night of the long knives of legend, the endless cycles of betrayal in history. He knew that innocence was no defense against necessity. If Hitler believed the SA was a threat to his alliance with the army, then the truth didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was survival. While Röhm waited in the suffocating heat of his cell, 400 miles away in Berlin, the architecture of his death was being finalized. The chancellery was a hive of nervous energy. The air in the capital was electric with fear. Rumors were flying through the streets that the SA had risen up, that Göring had been shot, that the army was marching on Berlin. Most of it was hysteria, whipped up by Goebbels' propaganda machine to justify the slaughter. Adolf Hitler had returned from Munich the previous evening, exhausted and pale. He had been greeted at Tempelhof Airport by Göring and Himmler, who presented him with a list of the traitors who had been executed in Berlin while he was away. The list was long. It included General von Schleicher and his wife Gregor Strasser, and dozens of others. Hitler had scanned the list, his face unreadable. He had nodded, accepting the blood sacrifice. But one name was still unresolved. Now, on this Sunday afternoon, Hitler was hosting a tea party in the gardens of the Chancellery. It was a surreal, macabre scene. The sun filtered through the leaves of the old trees, dappling the white tablecloths. Diplomatic families, children, and party officials mingled, sipping tea and eating cakes. Hitler moved among them, smiling, patting children on the head, playing the role of the benevolent uncle of the nation. But his eyes were distant. Every few minutes he would be pulled aside by Göring or Himmler, who hovered at the edge of the gathering like vultures in dress uniforms. They were relentless. "Röhm must die, mein Führer," Himmler whispered, his voice soft and reasonable. "He is the head of the conspiracy. If you cut off the limbs but leave the head, the monster will grow back. The SA will never be loyal as long as he breathes. He will rally the survivors. He will go to the army. He will destroy you." Göring, sweating in his white uniform, was more blunt. "The army demands it. Hindenburg demands it. You cannot stop halfway. If Röhm lives, you are weak. If he dies, you are the supreme judge of the German people." Hitler watched the children playing on the lawn, his gaze drifting to the women in their summer dresses. He thought of the man in the cell in Munich. He thought of the years of struggle, the shared meals, the music they had listened to, the dreams they had spun of a new Reich. He was sentimental, deeply so, but his sentimentality was a shallow pool. Beneath it lay a bedrock of absolute, terrifying pragmatism. He knew his deputies were right. Röhm was a loose end, a living witness to the chaotic criminal origins of the party, a man who knew too much. Hitler finally turned to them. The smile vanished. The mask of the statesman dropped. "It must be done," he said quietly, "but he must be given a chance to do it himself. He is an officer. He deserves the pistol." The order was given. It was relayed by telephone to Munich. The executioner had already been chosen. Theodor Eicke was the commandant of the Dachau concentration camp. He was a man who terrified even other Nazis. With a brutal, scarred face and a personality devoid of empathy, Eicke was the prototype of the SS man, fanatical, obedient, and utterly ruthless. He had spent the last year turning Dachau into a model of terror, perfecting the system of dehumanization that would soon spread across Europe. For Eicke, killing Röhm was not a tragedy. It was a promotion. It was a chance to prove that the SS was superior to the SA, that the black uniform was the future and the brown shirt was the past. Eicke selected his adjutant, SS Captain Michael Lippert, to accompany him. They armed themselves with Browning pistols. They did not take a firing squad. This was not a military execution. This was a mob hit sanctioned by the state. They drove to Stadelheim in the early afternoon. The heat was at its peak. The prison governor, a bureaucrat of the old school named Koch, tried to stop them. "I have no order for this," he protested, looking at the two SS officers with distaste. "Captain Röhm is a Reich minister. You cannot just walk in and shoot him. I need a warrant signed by the Minister of Justice." Eicke looked at the governor with a sneer. "The Führer is the law," he barked. "I have orders from Berlin. Stand aside, or you will be in the cell next to him." The governor, pale and shaking, stepped aside. He knew the world had changed. The rules he had lived by, warrants, judges, laws, were gone. There was only the will of the party. Eicke and Lippert marched down the long, echoing corridor of the new wing. Their jackboots rang on the stone. They stopped at Shell 474. Eicke signaled the guard to unlock the door. The key turned. The heavy iron door swung open. Röhm was sitting on his cot, shirtless, sweat glistening on his heavy chest. He looked up, expecting Hitler. Instead, he saw the two SS men. He knew Eicke by reputation. He knew what this meant. Eicke did not salute. He walked to the small wooden table in the center of the cell and placed two items on it. First, a loaded Browning pistol. Second, a copy of the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party newspaper. The ink was still fresh. "You have forfeited your life," Eicke said, his voice flat and cold. "The Führer gives you one last chance to draw the consequences." He pointed to the newspaper. The headline screamed in bold black Gothic type. "The Führer crushes the Röhm putsch. Revolt suppressed. Traitors executed." Beneath it was a lurid account of the purge, detailing the homosexual clique that had corrupted the youth of Germany and plotted against the state. Röhm stared at the paper. He didn't read the article. The headline was enough. It was the final betrayal, not just death, but disgrace. Adolf was not only killing him, he was erasing him. He was turning the architect of the SA into a pervert and a traitor. "You have 10 minutes, Eicke said. The two SS men turned and walked out. The door slammed shut. The key turned again. Röhm was alone with the gun. 10 minutes, 600 seconds. He stood up and walked to the table. He looked at the pistol. It was a dark, oily piece of metal. It offered a way out. A Roman death. A suicide would be an admission of guilt, yes, but it would be quick. It would be on his own terms. He could end the fear right now. He could put the barrel in his mouth and pull the trigger, and the heat, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it would all be gone. He picked up the gun. It was heavy. He checked the magazine. 1 bullet. He looked at the newspaper again. The lies burned him. Degenerate. Traitor. Mutineer. Röhm put the gun down. A surge of defiance rose in his chest, hotter than the stifling air of the cell. He was Ernst Röhm. He was a captain of the Royal Bavarian Army. He had bled for Germany in the Argonne Forest. He had bled for the party in the beer halls of Munich. He had built the very stairs that Hitler had climbed to power. He had not plotted a coup. He had not betrayed his friend. It was he who had been betrayed. If he killed himself, he was validating their lies. He was admitting that he was the monster they claimed he was. He was giving Hitler the clean ending he wanted. No, he whispered to the empty cell. He began to pace again. The anger gave him strength. He would not make it easy for them. He would not do their dirty work. If Adolf wanted him dead, Adolf would have to look him in the eye, or at least Adolf's butchers would have to pull the trigger themselves. They would have to murder him in cold blood. He would force them to be what they were, assassins. He walked to the window and looked at the patch of blue sky. He thought of his mother. He thought of the young men he had loved. He thought of the irony that he, the man who believed in the supremacy of the warrior bond, was dying because he had trusted a warrior brother too much. The 10 minutes were up. He heard the boots in the corridor again. They were coming back. Röhm stood in the center of the cell. He stripped off his shirt completely, standing bare-chested. He wanted them to see the scars, the map of his service, the proof of his courage. He pushed his chest out, standing at attention, the posture of a soldier facing a firing squad. The door opened. Ike and Lippert stood in the doorway. Ike looked at the table. The pistol was untouched. The newspaper was on the floor. Ike's face twisted in annoyance. He had hoped to avoid the mess. "You have not used the opportunity?" he asked. Röhm looked at him with utter contempt. His voice filled the small cell, booming and defiant. "If I am to be killed, let Adolf do it himself." Ike didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol. Lippert drew his. "Stand up!" Ike shouted, though Röhm was already standing. Röhm didn't flinch. He looked down the barrels of the guns. In that final second, a strange clarity washed over him. He raised his right arm, not in a plea, but in a salute, or perhaps an accusation. "Mein Führer," he cried out. It was a cry that would echo through history. Was it a final declaration of loyalty to the man he still loved? Was it a curse? Was he calling out to the friend who wasn't there? The cell exploded with noise. Crack! Crack! Lippert fired first. The bullet struck Röhm in the chest. He staggered back, his face contorted in shock. He didn't fall immediately. He was a bull of a man, and his adrenaline was surging. He gasped, clutching his chest, blood welling up over the old scars. He looked at Lippert with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. Ike stepped forward. He was not a man to leave a job half done. He raised his pistol and aimed for the head. Crack! The shot was point blank. Röhm collapsed onto the stone floor, his body twitching. The king of the machine guns, the lord of the SA, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, was a heap of cooling flesh on a prison floor. Ike holstered his weapon. He looked down at the body with cold indifference. "The traitor is dead," he said. They left the cell, locking the door on the corpse. The air in the corridor smelled of cordite and death. Outside, the sun was still shining. The birds were still singing. The citizens of Munich were enjoying their Sunday afternoon strolls, eating ice cream, listening to bands play in the parks. They did not know, or perhaps did not care, that the revolution had just eaten its own father. The night of the long knives was technically over. The primary target was dead, but the ripples of the murder were only just beginning to spread. The death of Ernst Röhm was the death of the radical revolutionary phase of Nazism. It was the victory of the SS, the victory of the police state, the victory of the cold, calculated evil over the hot, chaotic violence of the streets. Hitler received the news in Berlin a few minutes later. He was still at the garden party. An aide whispered in his ear. Hitler nodded, his face impassive. He took a sip of tea. He did not look triumphant. He looked relieved. The witness was gone. The past was buried. But there was a cost. The Jew was dead. The man who had been the only human connection in his life was gone. From this moment on, Hitler was truly alone. He was no longer a man. He was a monument, a god figure surrounded by sycophants and killers who feared him but did not love him. He had traded friendship for absolute power. The silence in Shell 474 was absolute. Ernst Röhm lay in his own blood, the newspaper headlines staring up at the ceiling. Traitor. The purge would continue for another day. The cleaning up would take weeks. The lies would last for 12 years. But the soul of the regime had been forged in that cell. The pact between the dictator and the army was sealed in blood. With Röhm dead, the army sold its soul. Grateful that their rival was gone, the generals ordered every soldier to swear a new oath, not to the Constitution but to Adolf Hitler personally. The road to absolute tyranny was open. The chaotic SA was replaced by the cold, mechanical terror of the SS. But for Hitler, the victory came with a terrible price. By killing the only man who loved him as a brother, he had condemned himself to die alone. 11 years later, in April 1945, sitting in his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, betrayed by the very men who had urged him to kill Röhm, perhaps he finally realized that loyalty purchased with blood is counterfeit. In the end, the ghost of the loyal captain still stands in that cell, chest bared, a warning from the past that echoes into the silence of history.